Polio. Today, on the 22nd day of my action, I will talk about the depopulation by vaccination strategy and the damage it has caused in terms of death, birth, and migration. But before I do this, I want to ask you to tell the censors to get out of my computer, which they disabled yesterday to make it impossible for me to edit, subtitle, and publish my lessons. You cannot hide from the truth, Poplio, not in the digital age. Remember, only the truth will set us free. The data presented here comes from a paper I published on the 26th of May 2024, entitled Depopulation by Vaccination, the Effects of the Pandemic on Births and Deaths in the G20 Nations. This paper uses the pre-pandemic year 2019 as the baseline and tallies the excess deaths. Question is, why would the system, governments, the UN, and organized religions take such a decision? For four reasons. First, vaccines, which are a biological method of depopulation, unlike endocrine disruptors, which are a chemical method of depopulation, can be used to target specific populations for specific purposes. The old can be prematurely killed, and the young can be permanently or temporarily sterilized as needed. Chemical poisoning cannot do that, since once you poison the entire food system, just as once you poison the well, everyone is affected equally, young and old alike. Furthermore, vaccines are cheap, and all it takes is one vaccine to do the intended damage. With chemicals, governments have to poison the food continuously, and beverages and water day after day, year after year. Therefore, governments decided to replace chemical with biological methods of depopulation. Second, the developed world has reached the last stage of the demographic transition, aka the depopulation program, and as such has inverted population pyramids that are economically unsustainable. Thus, too many old people and too few young people to bear the burden of the old. And that, unless stabilized, will inevitably lead to financial and economic collapse and a fall back into poverty. The onus of the depop program in the developed world, therefore, is to kill the old, while in the developing world, it is to sterilize the young. Third, the developing world's population is still growing, and the planet cannot possibly provide the resources needed to keep the existing 8 billion people alive at a civilized and sustainable standard of living, let alone double this number in 30 years, which is how long it would take for the global population to double absent brutal population control methods. Vaccines enable rapid depopulation with chemicals, which chemicals cannot. And fourth, mankind's current size and needs already outstrip the planet's carrying capacity, and unless a state of equilibrium is reestablished between our civilization and nature, we pose a global catastrophic risk to the survival of all life on Earth, including our own. Rather than face global catastrophe, governments cause global genocide. In the minds of the people who govern us, the impending threat of global catastrophe justifies global genocide. The documentary evidence shows that over the past 30 years, the system has developed a specific modus operandi for the depopulation by vaccination strategy that has become a predictable 5-step pattern. First step, covert project or overt exercises for an invented threat by an imagined boogeyman. The threat is a fictitious virus, and the boogeyman a rogue state, non-existent terrorists, a lab leak, or some poor wild animal that is scapegoated as the source of the so-called infection. Second step, an engineered attack that uses that particular threat or something very similar. The attack is blamed on a fictitious enemy and results in a fictitious epidemic or pandemic. Third step, A scientific fix in the form of a vaccine or drug is presented as the solution and as the salvation. And the science behind this scientific fix is obscure and cannot be challenged. Medicine is hailed as God. Fourth step, to force people to take the vaccine or drug, abusive legislation is passed that is supposedly meant to protect people from the very threat that the system has invented, but that in fact erodes the rule of law and makes fundamental rights and liberties conditional. The excuse of public health and public safety is used for this purpose. Fifth and last, massive institutional and technical buildup of the military-industrial complex and a budget increase to scale up the production and distribution of the said scientific fix. No amount of money is too large when a depopulation method is concerned. This five-step plan was followed for the COVID pandemic, as was followed for the anthrax scare of the 1990s, the smallpox, SARS, avian flu, and swine flu outbreaks of the 2000s, and the MERS, polio, Ebola, and Zika outbreaks that were unleashed on mankind from 2010 to 2020 in preparation for the final assault with COVID. Now, let us look at how many people were killed from 2000 to 2003 across the G20. Keep in mind that when I wrote the paper in May 2023, the vital statistics for 2024 and in some cases even for 2023 were not yet published. My paper, therefore, considers only data from 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. That's just 4 years. My paper looks at excess deaths, deficient births, and net migration, the three factors that influence population growth or decline. Now, let us turn our gaze to these posters, and I'm going to start with the G20 nations. This poster shows that there were, across the G20 nations, 26,453,000 births prevented. By the way, I'm rounding up the numbers to read them quicker. And 25,876,000 deaths caused. Keep in mind that these people died worse than dogs and were buried worse than dogs. They were buried in black plastic bags without loved ones, without funeral services, without priests, without anything. And last, 22,393,000 net migrants were pushed across borders. So these are tremendous numbers, both in terms of real numbers and as percentages. As percentages, the 26,453,000 births prevented constitutes 0.51% of the 5.1 billion total population of the G20 nations. The 25,876,000 deaths caused constitute 0.5% of the 5.1 billion people, and the 22,393,000 net migrations constitute 0.43% of the total population of 5.14 billion. So we're talking about a percentage point, half a percentage point for all three categories. These are tremendous numbers that caused tremendous suffering, disruptions, and at a tremendous cost, both financial and social, and political, might I add. Now, at the top here, I have the large nations or the block of nations. Here, for instance, I have the EU. Below that, on the second row, I have Western nations, and below that, the non-Western nations. So all in all, we have 20 nations. That's the G20 bloc. For the European Union, we have 958,000 births prevented. That's 0.21% of the total population. 1,854,000 deaths caused. That's 0.41% of the total population. And 6,670,000 migrants. That's 1.49% of the total population. Once again, tremendous numbers. By the way, Europe managed to go into depop mode since 2012, but since 2020, the population itself is actually decreasing. That's because deaths far outstrip or far outnumber the births as a result of the COVID pandemic. Um, since 2020, more than a million fewer birds. We have more than a million fewer birds um, across the EU than deaths. Hence, the population is decreasing rapidly. In the United States, we have 453,135 birds prevented. That's 0.13% of the total population. 1,795,000 deaths caused. That's 0.54% of the total population. And 3.2 million immigrants that were pushed into the country. That's 0.97% of the population. That's almost 1%. In Russia, 520,000 birds prevented, that's 0.36% of the population. 1 million deaths caused, that's 0.71% of the total population. And 1.46 million immigrants, that's 1% of the total population. Russia, by the way, is in depop mode since 1992, but this depop mode was accelerated during the pandemic. In China, we have 17,380,000 birds prevented. That's 1.23% of the total population. 1.7 million deaths caused. That's 0.12% of the total population. And 855,000 immigrants. People have emigrated. So we have a net loss of people in China. That's 0.06% of the total population. And as a result of the pandemic, China managed to go into depop mode since 2022, and it currently loses circa 2 million people a year, so they have 2 million more deaths than births. Which is, by the way, every country in the G20 tried to go into depop mode. Not everyone succeeded. In India, we have 2.25 million birds prevented. That's 0.16% of the population. 13 million deaths caused. That's 0.92% of the total population. And 1.3 million emigrants, so people who have left the country. So they have a net loss of people to the tune of 0.09% of the total population. In Japan, 310,000 birds prevented. That's 0.25% of the total population. 464,000 deaths caused. That's 0.37% of the total population. And 375,000 immigrants. So a net gain of people. That's 0.30% of the total population. Japan has been in depop mode since 2005, but the depop mode was greatly accelerated through the pandemic. Now Japan loses circa 900,000 people a year, so they have 900,000 more deaths than births. Keep in mind that all these death numbers that I'm giving you, the mortality data, is in excess of the normal. The normal being the year 2019, which I used as the baseline. Okay, now let's move on to the second tier of countries, starting with Australia. 27,990 births prevented, that's 0.1% of the total population. 37,000 deaths caused, that's 0.14% of the total population. And 515,000 immigrants, that's 1.92% of the total population. So immigration here played the most important role in Australia's strategy of population control during the pandemic. In Canada, we have 46,848 births prevented, that's 0.12% of the total population. 136,559 deaths caused, that's 0.34% of the total population. And 888,000 immigrants, that's 2.22% of the total population. Once again, Canada, like Australia, being new world countries and relatively unpopulated, they were able to take in a lot of immigrants to compensate for their old age dependency ratios. Incidentally, both Australia and Canada published false numbers during 2020, 2021, and the numbers were revised later. But the reason they published false numbers with far greater deaths than were subsequently presented was to scare the population, create that impression of a killer virus on the loose. In France, 131,000 births prevented, that's 0.2% of the total population. 182,000 deaths caused, that's 0.28% of the total population, and 173,000 immigrants, that's 0.26%. In so doing, France's population has been stabilized. It hasn't gone into depop mode yet, but it is stable. In Germany, we have 146,690 births prevented. Once again, this is above the normal, the baseline being 2019. 345,000 deaths caused, that's 0.41% of the total population, and 2.8 million immigrants. Let me say that again, 2.8 million immigrants, that's 3.34% of the total population, by far the greatest number in the entire G20 bloc of countries. Germany has been in depop mode since 1972, but as a result of the pandemic, now deaths outstrip births by some 350,000 a year, which is why Germany so desperately needs immigrants. In Italy, we have 102,523 births prevented, that's 0.17% of the total population. 279,000 deaths caused, that's 0.47% of the total population, and 760,000 immigrants, that's 1.29% of the total population. Italy has been in depop mode since 1993, but as in the case of Germany and all other G20 nations, now the number of deaths is far greater than before. Turkey, 564,275 births prevented, that's 0.66% of the total population. 342,854 deaths, that's 0.4% of the total population, and 770,000 emigrants, so people that have left the country that have a net loss of people of 0.9% of the total population. In the United Kingdom, 131,000 births prevented, that's 0.19% of the total population. 255,000 deaths caused, that's 0.38% of the total population. And 786,000 immigrants gained, that's 1.16% of the total population. The UK has been in depop mode, well, entered depop mode in 2020 for the first time, and then had a growth for 2021, 2022, and has gone back into depop mode in 2023. So it has managed to stabilize its population. Now, South Korea, we have 198,000 births prevented, that's 0.39% of the total population. 167,000 deaths caused, that's 0.33% of the total population, and just 109,000 immigrants, that's 0.20% of the total population. South Korea has been in depop mode since 2020, so it entered depop mode as a result of the pandemic strategy. South Africa, 55,000 births prevented, that's 0.09%, so an insignificant change. 456,000 deaths caused, that's 0.9%, a significant increase. And 158,000 immigrants, that's 0.25% of the total population. Still relatively modest numbers compared to Western nations. Saudi Arabia, 131,000 births prevented, that's 0.36% of the total population. 34,000 deaths caused, that's 0.09%, an insignificant increase. And 1,121,000 emigrants, so people who've left the country, a net loss of people, that's a whopping 3% of the total population. By the way, the people who have left were the migrant workers that were in the country. You'll know that Saudi Arabia, like Qatar and other Gulf states, have a huge number of immigrants who do all the work. Okay, in Mexico we have 1 million births prevented, that's 0.84% of the population, a huge number. 829,000 deaths caused, that's 0.65%, once again, a huge number. And 164,000 emigrants, so a net loss of people, that's 0.13%. In Indonesia, we have 436,000 births prevented, that's 0.17% of the population. 1,600,000 deaths caused, that's huge, that's 0.96% of the total population. And 114,000 emigrants, or people who have left, a net loss of people, that's 0.04% of the total population. In Brazil, we have 1 million Births prevented, that's 0.49% of the total population. Nearly 900,000 deaths caused, that's 0.41% of the total population. And nearly 90,000 immigrants gained, that's 0.04% of the total population. Argentina, which by the way didn't publish their 2023 numbers, so this is only for going up to 2022, we have 453,000 births prevented, that's 0.99% of the total population, a huge number. 240,000 deaths caused, that's 0.52% of the total population, and 12,000 immigrants gained, that's 0.27% of the total population. Imagine the suffering. Imagine all the families that have lost loved ones. Imagine all these millions of people dying in horrible circumstances. That is the result, in part, of the Church's policy. Pope Leo, I hope he will not repeat Pope Francis's mistakes. In terms of births prevented, by the way, to give you the ranking, Argentina is the worst with 0.99% of the total population, followed by Mexico, Turkey, Brazil, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Japan, China, EU, France, UK, Italy, Indonesia, Germany, India, US, Canada, Australia, and last, South Africa with just 0.09% of the total population, an insignificant number and percentage for South Africa. In terms of deaths caused, Indonesia is the worst with 0.96% of the total population, followed by India, and then South Africa, and then Russia, Mexico, US, Argentina, Italy, Brazil, EU, Germany, Turkey, UK, Japan, Canada, South Korea, France, Australia, China, and last, Saudi Arabia with just 0.09%. Once again, an insignificant change. And in terms of net migration, Germany is by far the worst with an astounding 3.34% net gain of immigrants, followed by Canada, Australia, EU, Italy, UK, Russia, US, Japan, Argentina, France, South Africa, South Korea, Brazil, and Indonesia. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Mexico, India, and China experienced net emigration. In other words, more people left the country than entered. This is the dismal tally of the horrific method of depopulation by vaccination, and the deaths keep piling up. Once all the data is in, which has started to come in for 2024, I will recalculate and present the updated data. If governments, the UN system, and organized religions continue in this way, there will be a cultural revolution Chinese style, whereby the people will exterminate the elites. The people will start their own depopulation program. And you, Pope Leo, like all your predecessors, have made common cause with the elites, hence your shameful silence. If you do not change course, the third prophecy of Fatima is what awaits you.